The dust kicked up by the approaching wagon settled like a shroud over the Whitmore ranch as Eleanor May watched her future arrive in the form of a sickly stranger and a leather satchel full of land deeds. At 23, she had never been kissed, never been courted, and certainly never imagined her first marriage proposal would come through a business transaction conducted entirely by telegraph. "That him?" asked Jeremiah, her grizzled foreman, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt with practiced precision. Eleanor smoothed her best blue dress, the same one she'd worn to her father's funeral 6 months prior, and nodded grimly. "Ezekiel Thornton of the Tennessee Thorntons. Owns half the mountain territory between here and the Cumberland Gap." The wagon creaked to a halt, and Eleanor got her first good look at her intended. Ezekiel Thornton was tall and gaunt, with hollow cheeks that spoke of recent illness and eyes the color of winter storms. His clothes hung loose on his frame, suggesting he'd lost considerable weight, but his hands were steady as he climbed down from the driver's seat. "Miss Whitmore, I presume?" His voice carried the musical cadence of the Appalachian mountains, soft as morning mist but with an underlying strength that surprised her. "That's right." Eleanor lifted her chin, determined to appear confident despite the butterflies performing acrobatics in her stomach. "You're punctual, Mr. Thornton. I appreciate that in a business partner." A ghost of a smile flickered across his gaunt features. "Business partner? Is that what we're calling it?" Heat crept up Eleanor's neck. "Well, that is to say—" "Relax, Miss Whitmore. I understand the nature of our arrangement perfectly." He reached into the wagon and withdrew a wooden crate that seemed to tax his limited strength. "I brought you a wedding gift." Eleanor peered into the crate and gasped. Inside were 6 of the most beautiful chickens she'd ever seen, Rhode Island reds with feathers that gleamed like burnished copper in the afternoon sun. "They're prize birds," Ezekiel explained, noting her surprise. "Figured a working ranch could use good laying hens more than fancy china or such." Despite herself, Eleanor felt a smile tugging at her lips. "That's actually quite thoughtful. Most men would have brought flowers or jewelry." "Most men aren't marrying for land deeds and mutual convenience," he replied with dry humor that caught her off guard. The circuit preacher, Reverend McKinley, emerged from the house where he'd been waiting with a cup of Eleanor's coffee and a slice of her famous apple pie. "Well now, are we ready to proceed with the ceremony? I've got 2 more weddings to perform before sundown, and Mrs. McKinley will tan my hide if I'm late for supper again." Eleanor's hands trembled as she smoothed her skirts. This was really happening. In a few minutes, she'd be Mrs. Ezekiel Thornton, married to a man she'd known for all of 10 minutes. But the alternative, losing the ranch to creditors and ending up destitute, was far worse than an arranged marriage to a sickly mountain man. "I suppose we should get this over with," she said, then immediately regretted her choice of words. "I mean, I know what you meant," Ezekiel said gently. "And you're right. Best to handle business efficiently." The ceremony was brief and businesslike, conducted on the front porch with Jeremiah and the ranch hands as witnesses. Eleanor's voice shook only slightly as she recited her vows, while Ezekiel's remained steady despite the occasional cough that racked his thin frame. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend McKinley announced with the enthusiasm of a man eager to move on to his next appointment. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as Ezekiel stepped closer. His hands were surprisingly warm as they cupped her face, and his lips were gentle when they brushed against hers, a chaste kiss that somehow managed to send sparks racing through her entire body. "There," he murmured against her ear. "Now we're legally bound to this madness." The Reverend departed with unseemly haste, leaving the newlyweds standing awkwardly on the porch while the ranch hands dispersed to their evening chores. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I suppose you'll want to see the house," Eleanor said, suddenly aware that she was now sharing her home with a virtual stranger. "I've prepared the spare room for you, I thought, given the circumstances." "That's considerate of you," Ezekiel replied. "I wouldn't want to impose on your privacy any more than necessary." Eleanor led him through the modest ranch house, pointing out the kitchen, parlor, and finally the spare bedroom she'd hastily prepared that morning. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand beneath the single window. "It's not much," she apologized. "It's more than adequate." He set his single carpetbag on the bed and turned to face her. "Eleanor, may I call you Eleanor? I want you to know that I have no expectations beyond our business arrangement. You needn't worry about marital obligations." Relief and something that might have been disappointment warred in Eleanor's chest. "I appreciate your consideration, Mr. Thornton." "Ezekiel," he corrected. "We're married now after all." A violent coughing fit suddenly seized him, doubling him over and leaving flecks of blood on his handkerchief. Eleanor rushed forward instinctively, her hand on his back as the spasms racked his thin frame. "Are you all right? Should I fetch the doctor?" "No doctor," he gasped when the fit finally subsided. "There's nothing he can do that hasn't already been tried." Eleanor stared at the blood on his handkerchief with growing alarm. "Ezekiel, what exactly is wrong with you?" His storm-gray eyes met hers with unflinching honesty. "Consumption, Eleanor. I'm dying." The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd known he was sickly, but this? How long? 6 months, maybe less. He straightened with visible effort. "I should have told you before the ceremony, but I was afraid you'd change your mind." Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. She'd married a dying man. In 6 months she'd be a widow, alone again with nothing but his land deeds to show for this bizarre arrangement. "Why?" she whispered. "Why marry me if you're—" "Because I need someone to inherit my holdings when I'm gone," he said simply. "And you need those holdings to save your ranch. Still a fair trade, Eleanor. Perhaps fairer now that you know the truth." 3 weeks into their peculiar marriage, Eleanor had developed a routine that revolved around caring for her dying husband while maintaining the demanding schedule of ranch life. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast and check on Ezekiel, whose coughing fits had grown more frequent and violent. Then she spent her days working alongside Jeremiah and the hands, returning to the house each evening to find Ezekiel reading by the fireplace, looking frielier than when she'd left him. "You don't have to coddle me," he said one evening as she brought him a cup of her special honey and whiskey remedy. "I'm not an invalid yet." "Could have fooled me," Eleanor replied with the dry humor she'd developed as a defense mechanism. "You've been sitting in that chair so long, I'm starting to think you've taken root." Ezekiel's laugh turned into a cough, but his eyes sparkled with amusement. "Careful, wife. Keep talking to me like that and I might start thinking you actually care." The word wife still sent an odd flutter through Eleanor's chest. Despite the clinical nature of their arrangement, she found herself genuinely concerned about Ezekiel's welfare. He was intelligent, well-read, and possessed a wry sense of humor that caught her off guard at the most unexpected moments. "I've been thinking," she said, settling into the chair across from him, "about your land holdings. You mentioned they include timber rights and mineral claims. Among other things." Ezekiel studied her face in the firelight. "Having second thoughts about our bargain?" "No, just trying to understand what I'm inheriting." Eleanor tucked her feet under her, a gesture that would have scandalized her mother but felt natural in the privacy of their home. "I want to be a good steward of what you're leaving me." Something shifted in Ezekiel's expression, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. Most people would be calculating the monetary value, not worrying about stewardship. "I'm not most people." "No," he agreed softly. "You're not." The next morning brought disaster in the form of a spooked horse and Eleanor's own stubborn pride. She'd been working with a particularly ornery mare when the animal reared without warning, striking out with iron-shod hooves. Eleanor tried to dodge but wasn't quite fast enough. The horse's hoof caught her shoulder, sending her sprawling into the corral fence with a sickening crack. "Miss Eleanor!" Jeremiah's shout brought the entire ranch running, including Ezekiel, who appeared from the house moving faster than she'd seen him move since his arrival. Don't fuss," Eleanor gasped, trying to push herself upright despite the fire shooting through her left shoulder. "It's just a bump." "Like hell it is," Ezekiel said, dropping to his knees beside her with complete disregard for his own fragile health. His hands were gentle but thorough as they examined her shoulder, and Eleanor was surprised by the competence of his touch. "Jeremiah, help me get her to the house. And send someone for Doc Patterson." "No doctor," Eleanor protested weakly. "Can't afford." "I can afford it," Ezekiel cut her off, his voice brooking no argument. Jeremiah now. The next few hours passed in a haze of pain and embarrassment as Doc Patterson confirmed what Ezekiel had already suspected. Eleanor's shoulder was dislocated, and she'd cracked at least 2 ribs. The doctor reset the shoulder with practiced efficiency while Ezekiel held her hand, his own face pale with sympathetic pain. She'll need to rest for at least a week, Doc Patterson instructed as he packed his instruments. No lifting, no riding, and definitely no wrestling with horses. I can't rest for a week, Eleanor protested from her bed, where Ezekiel had insisted she remain. The ranch will survive without you for a few days, Ezekiel finished firmly. Jeremiah's been running this place longer than you've been alive. He can handle things. After the doctor left, Eleanor found herself alone with her husband for the first time since their wedding night. The pain medication had left her feeling loose-limbed and strangely vulnerable, and she was acutely aware of Ezekiel's presence as he moved around the room, straightening things that didn't need straightening. You don't have to stay, she said. I'm sure you have better things to do than nursemaid a clumsy wife. Ezekiel paused in his restless movement, turning to face her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Eleanor, do you know why I really married you? The question caught her off guard. For someone to inherit your land. That's part of it. He moved closer to the bed, his storm-gray eyes serious. But the truth is I was lonely. Dying alone in those mountains, with nothing but the sound of my own coughing for company. When your letter came responding to my advertisement, you sounded strong, capable, like someone who could face hard truths without flinching. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, though whether from the pain medication or his unexpected honesty, she couldn't say. I'm not as strong as you think. Stronger, he corrected, settling into the chair beside her bed. You've been taking care of me for 3 weeks without complaint, even though I'm essentially a stranger who's going to die and leave you with a mess to sort out. It's not a mess, Eleanor said softly. It's a gift. You're giving me a future I never could have had otherwise. Ezekiel reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing against hers where they lay on the coverlet. What if I told you I wanted more than a business arrangement? What if I said that these past weeks have been the happiest I've had in years? Eleanor's heart began to race, though she couldn't tell if it was from hope or fear. I'd say you might be delirious from your medication. His laugh was soft and genuine. Maybe I am. But delirium has a way of revealing truths we're too scared to speak when we're clear-headed. Ezekiel? Eleanor turned her hand palm up, allowing their fingers to intertwine. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe we could try being married for real. For whatever time I have left. His grip tightened slightly. I know it's not fair to ask knowing how this ends, but I find myself hoping. Hoping what? That you might come to care for me. Even a little. Even knowing you'll lose me. Eleanor studied his face in the lamplight, the sharp cheekbones, the eyes that held both hope and resignation, the mouth that had kissed her so gently on their wedding day. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks, this dying stranger had become important to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. I already do care, she whispered. More than I should. More than is wise. The smile that spread across Ezekiel's face was like sunrise after a long, dark night. Then we're both fools. The very worst kind, Eleanor agreed, and for the first time since her accident, she felt like everything might actually be all right. 2 months into their marriage, Eleanor had discovered that living with a dying man was nothing like she'd expected. Instead of the grim, depressing atmosphere she'd anticipated, the ranch house had become filled with laughter, heated debates about everything from cattle breeding to literature, and a warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. Ezekiel's health had stabilized somewhat. The mountain air and Eleanor's determined nursing had given him more good days than bad, though they both knew it was temporary. On his better days, he insisted on helping with ranch work, much to Eleanor's exasperation and secret delight. You're supposed to be resting, she scolded as she found him in the barn, carefully mending a broken bridle with the patience of a man who had learned to value small tasks. I've been resting for 2 months, he replied without looking up from his work. If I rest any more, I'll forget how to be useful. Eleanor leaned against the stall door, watching his long fingers work the leather with surprising skill. Where did you learn to do that? My father was a saddle maker before he struck it rich in timber. Ezekiel's voice carried a note of nostalgia. Said a man should know how to work with his hands, no matter how much money he had. Smart man. He was. Ezekiel finally looked up, and Eleanor was struck by how much healthier he looked than when he'd first arrived. His cheeks had filled out slightly, and his eyes held a vitality that hadn't been there before. Eleanor, there's something I need to tell you. The serious tone made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. What is it? Are you feeling worse? Should I send for the doctor? No, nothing like that. He set down the bridle and moved closer, his hands settling gently on her shoulders. I've been corresponding with my lawyer in Tennessee. About the inheritance. Eleanor's heart sank. You're changing your mind about leaving me the land. Just the opposite. Ezekiel's thumbs traced small circles on her shoulders, a gesture that had become familiar and comforting over the past weeks. I'm having him draw up papers that will transfer everything to you immediately. As a wedding gift. Eleanor stared at him in shock. But why? What if you live longer than expected? What if? What if I want my wife to have security now instead of having to wait for me to die? His voice was gentle but firm. Eleanor, these past months with you have been a gift I never expected. I want to give you something in return. Tears pricked Eleanor's eyes. You've already given me everything. A home, a future, companionship. She paused, then added quietly, love. The word hung between them like a bridge neither had dared to cross before. Ezekiel's hands stilled on her shoulders, his storm-gray eyes searching her face. Love? He repeated softly. Eleanor felt heat creep up her neck, but she didn't look away. Yes, love. I know it wasn't part of our arrangement, but I can't help how I feel. Instead of responding with words, Ezekiel cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with a passion that took her breath away. This wasn't the chaste peck from their wedding day, this was the kiss of a man claiming his woman, full of desire and desperate tenderness. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. I love you too, Ezekiel whispered against her forehead. God help me, I love you so much it terrifies me. Why terrifying? Because loving you makes dying so much harder. His voice cracked slightly. Because I finally have something worth living for and I can't. Eleanor pulled back to look at him, her heart breaking at the pain in his eyes. Then we'll make the most of whatever time we have. No more talk of dying, Ezekiel. While you're here, while you're mine, we're going to live. That evening, for the first time since their wedding, Ezekiel didn't retire to the spare room. Instead, he followed Eleanor to the master bedroom, his presence both thrilling and terrifying. Eleanor's hands shook as she unpinned her hair, acutely aware of his eyes on her. Are you sure about this? He asked softly. I don't want you to feel obligated. I'm sure. Eleanor turned to face him, her hair falling in waves around her shoulders. I want to be your wife in every way, Ezekiel. For however long we have. What followed was a night of gentle discovery, of whispered endearments and careful touches. Ezekiel was patient with her inexperience, his hands and mouth teaching her pleasures she'd never imagined. When he finally made her truly his wife, Eleanor understood why people wrote poetry about love. No words could adequately describe the feeling of two souls becoming one. Afterward, they lay entwined in the darkness, Eleanor's head on Ezekiel's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. I have a confession, she murmured against his skin. What's that? I'm glad you answered my advertisement. Even knowing how this ends, I'm glad. Ezekiel's arms tightened around her. Even though I'm dying? Especially because you're dying. Eleanor lifted her head to meet his surprised gaze. Because it means you chose to spend your last months with me. Out of all the women in the world, you chose me. Eleanor Morrison Thornton, Ezekiel said solemnly, you are the most remarkable woman I've ever known. Morrison Thornton? Eleanor raised an eyebrow. That's quite a mouthful. You could always just be Eleanor Thornton. I could, she agreed, settling back against his chest. But I like Morrison Thornton. It sounds like a woman who owns half a mountain and isn't afraid to use it. Ezekiel's laughter rumbled through his chest, and Eleanor smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own fears about the future. But tonight she was exactly where she belonged, in the arms of the man she loved, building memories that would have to last a lifetime. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a transformation that no one could have predicted. Eleanor woke one morning in late March to find Ezekiel already up and dressed, standing by the bedroom window with an expression of wonder on his face. What is it? She asked, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders as she joined him. Look, he said simply, pointing toward the pasture. Eleanor followed his gaze and gasped. The prized chickens he'd brought as a wedding gift had multiplied dramatically over the winter, and the pasture was now dotted with dozens of fluffy chicks following their mothers in neat little parades. They're beautiful, she breathed. But that's not what has you looking like you've seen a miracle. Ezekiel turned to face her, and Eleanor was struck by how different he looked from the gaunt, hollow-eyed man who'd arrived 6 months ago. His face had filled out, his color was good, and most remarkably, he hadn't had a serious coughing fit in over 2 weeks. "Eleanor," he said carefully, "when was the last time you heard me cough blood?" Eleanor's heart began to race as she considered the question. It's been a while. But that doesn't mean." 3 weeks, Ezekiel interrupted. 3 weeks without blood and only minor coughing fits that feel more like clearing my throat than... He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I think I might be getting better." The words hung between them like a soap bubble, beautiful, impossible, and fragile enough to burst at the slightest touch. "That's not possible," Eleanor whispered. "The doctor said. The doctor said I had 6 months to live, and that was 7 months ago." Ezekiel's hands found hers, his grip strong and steady. "I know it sounds crazy, but I feel stronger every day. The mountain air, you're cooking, having something to live for. Maybe it's made a difference." Eleanor wanted to believe him, but she'd learned not to hope for miracles. "Ezekiel, consumption doesn't just go away. Sometimes it does." The voice came from the doorway where Doc Patterson stood with his medical bag and a bemused expression. "Sorry to interrupt, but Jeremiah let me in. Said you'd been asking about consumption recovery rates." Eleanor felt her cheeks burn. She had indeed been pestering Jeremiah with questions, unable to shake the feeling that Ezekiel was improving despite all medical logic. "Doc," Ezekiel said, "I'd like you to examine me thoroughly." What followed was the longest hour of Eleanor's life. She paced the parlor while Doc Patterson conducted his examination in the bedroom, listening to Ezekiel's lungs, checking his reflexes, and asking detailed questions about his symptoms. When the doctor finally emerged, his expression was one of professional bewilderment mixed with genuine amazement. "Well?" Eleanor demanded, unable to bear the suspense any longer. "In 30 years of practice," Doc Patterson said slowly, "I've seen maybe 3 cases of consumption that went into what we call spontaneous remission. Ezekiel appears to be the 4th. Eleanor's knees gave out and she sank into the nearest chair. "You mean?" "I mean his lungs are clear, his color is good, and he shows no signs of active disease." The doctor shook his head in wonder. "I can't explain it medically, but I can't argue with the evidence either." Ezekiel appeared in the doorway, fully dressed and grinning like a man who'd just been handed his life back. "Did you hear that, wife? Looks like you're stuck with me for a lot longer than we planned." Eleanor burst into tears, great, heaving sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. All the fear she'd been carrying, all the grief she'd been preparing for, all the love she'd been hoarding against future loss came pouring out in a flood of relief and joy. "Hey now," Ezekiel said, crossing to kneel beside her chair. "I thought this was good news." "It is," Eleanor sobbed. "It's the best news. I was so scared of losing you." "You're not losing me," he said firmly, pulling her into his arms. "Looks like you're stuck with this old mountain man for the foreseeable future." "Old?" Eleanor pulled back to look at him through her tears. "You're 32. "Ancient," he agreed solemnly, then broke into a grin. "But apparently I'm ancient with a clean bill of health." Doc Patterson cleared his throat diplomatically. "I'll leave you two to celebrate. But Ezekiel, I want to see you every 3 months for the next year, just to be sure." After the doctor left, Eleanor and Ezekiel sat on their front porch, watching the sun set over the ranch that was now truly theirs. The land deeds had been transferred weeks ago, making Eleanor one of the wealthiest women in the territory, but that seemed insignificant compared to the gift of time they'd just been given. "So," Ezekiel said, his arm around Eleanor's shoulders, "what do we do now?" "Now?" Eleanor smiled, leaning into his warmth. "Now we live. We build something together, raise those chickens, maybe add some children to the mix if we're blessed." "Children?" Ezekiel's voice held a note of wonder. "I never thought. I assumed." "Well, you'd better start thinking about it," Eleanor said with mock sternness. "Because I have plans for you, Ezekiel Thornton. Big plans that involve a very long and happy marriage." "Yes, ma'am," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I'm at your service." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eleanor reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. She'd married a dying stranger for land and security, only to discover that sometimes the most practical arrangements could bloom into the deepest love. "Ezekiel," she said softly. "Thank you for answering my advertisement." "Thank you for placing it," he replied. "Best business decision I ever made." Eleanor laughed, the sound carrying across the ranch like a promise of all the good things to come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adventures, and new opportunities to build the life they'd never dared to dream possible. But tonight, they were simply a man and woman in love, sitting on their own front porch, watching their chickens settle in for the night and planning a future that stretched out before them like an endless prairie, full of possibility and bright with hope.